The difficult times are when our faith is deepened. This is what brings us closer to God and gives our relationship with God meaning. Hi, and welcome. It's easy to say, I trust in God when everything is going very well, when all the birds are chirping in the trees and the sun is shining and there's not a cloud in sight. But when things are difficult, when challenges start to come up, things are not really going well in your life, those are the times in which your relationship with God is tested. It's usually whenever we're facing a very impossible situation, when it seems like things would never change for the better. This is when our relationship with God is forged. This is when it is really put to the test. The rosaries that we do, the devotions, praying consistently throughout the day, the weeks, the months, all these things we probably started to do maybe because we passed through hard times, through difficult times, when we wanted God to answer our prayers, when we were facing very desperate situations, and we needed Him to come to our aid. If it is that our life moved very smoothly, without any challenges, without any difficulties, I think few of us would really actually approach God and have a consistent prayer life because we wouldn't need Him. Sometimes God can lead you into a storm. I used to think that if I did my prayers, if I made my devotions, everything would just be simple and all would just fall into place. Back then, I used to think that I would go hard for God. I would go the extra mile and I would try to do everything right. That's the zeal which we have usually whenever we start in the spiritual life, early on in our journey. We want to be perfect. We want to do things for God, to go 100%. I felt that if I did all my devotions, if I did all my prayers and everything would just be simple. But this is not the case. There are certain things that you can only discover in the spiritual life and about God only when you go through difficult times. You cannot learn them any other way. An example of this would be the disciples. When they got in the boat with Jesus and they encountered a very fierce storm. And Jesus at the time was sleeping and they thought that they were going to die. The disciples were doing everything right at that point. They were following Jesus and they were listening to Him and following all His instructions. And Jesus still led them into a storm. They did not get into trouble or fall into that storm because they were doing things wrong. They did everything right, but still they faced a storm. If they had not been in that storm, there were certain things they would not have discovered about Jesus. There are certain things about God that you can only discover when you go through the storms, when you go through the difficult times. And there is no other way in which you can learn these things and find out these truths about God. He places you there so that you can learn certain things about Him, that you can learn certain things about your journey. And it also helps you to trust in God. Following God in the spiritual life gets much easier the more we trust God, the more we allow Him to be God and do what He wants with our life. We need to allow Him to be God. This only happens when you get to a point when you know that you are always going to be fine, as long as you entrust yourself to Him. You know that somehow it's always going to work out, no matter how difficult the situation is, even if it feels like you cannot see how things can ever get better, and you don't see how you could ever get out of whatever desert or whatever trouble that you're facing. Once you start to trust in Him and believe that He will always work out things for the better in your situation, and that when you look back in your past and in your life and start to look at all the times in which He has pulled you out of difficult situations, when it felt like all hope was lost, when you look back on those times and you realize how God worked things out for the better, you get to think of how paranoid probably you were about the situation, and how you probably overreacted and seemed to only look at the bad side of a situation and not the good. Perhaps this is what it is. Sometimes maybe when things are difficult, we tend to look only on the bad side of things. Sometimes it's actually a great advantage to actually shut all the negativity out, and to continue to look towards God. Once you master that, then your spiritual life you actually become more effective. You're actually more efficient in following God. Well, efficiency is the wrong word to use, but you kind of are able to continue soldiering on during the difficult times. And this is what the saints did. If you take, for example, Padre Pio, there was a time when he actually was not allowed to say Mass. People would come up to him and say all these hurtful things and say, maybe this guy is a fraud. He doesn't really have those stigmata. He actually inflicted those wounds on him. And imagine how painful that period was for Padre Pio. But he still continued to soldier on and follow God and have faith in him during those periods. And it seems that the wounds which are inflicted on the heart are the most difficult to deal with. When people come up and say, this guy is, he's not really what he is, and you are not there to actually defend yourself. Those are the very difficult things to actually go through. And Padre Pio went through that, the period when he was not allowed to say Mass. He was still able to knuckle down and continue to follow God. This is the same with most of the saints. Take, for example, Saint Faustina. There were times when people in the convent would question whether she had those visions, or maybe she was just making everything up. It's those types of challenges. It's those types of situations which are very difficult in the spiritual life. It's those types of situations that draw us close to God. They are the ones which deepen our relationship with Him. They give our relationship with Him meaning. It's because those troubles, those difficult times create a history. It's because they allow God to show His glory and His strength and might in our lives. And these are the times which we need to look back on whenever we encounter even more difficult times in the future, and tell ourselves that, you know what, it's not really that bad. I've gone through a time where things were this bad and this challenging, and I went through it through prayer and believing that God had the power to save me, because He always has the power. We just need to believe that He's a God who works for our own good, and that He's a loving God, and that He would never abandon us. Remember, Jesus says, I will be with you until the end. And He is a God of truth, and He's a God of justice. He would never abandon us in our time of difficulty. Remember, He's a faithful and loving God. Until next time, take care.